Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our first joint webinar with the Embassy of the Republic of Poland in Israel. I'm Talia Deckel, Director of Press at the Jerusalem Press Club. We had originally planned on holding this event in real life, not through the computer, but that's what we have to deal with in these strange times. I'd like to thank Katarzyna Rivka Ivanchka, Head of Communications and Public Diplomacy at the Embassy, and the driving force behind this event. Today we'll examine the connection between journalism and diplomacy. We'll look specifically at whether these two operate independently and how the former impacts the latter. We are joined by a very special group of people, each with his or her own personal connection to the material. Before each speaker draws on their experiences, I'd like to invite Jerusalem Press Club founding director, General Uli Dromi, and former director of the Israeli Government Press Office for opening remarks. Thank you, Uri.
Thank you, Talia. I want to welcome the distinguished speakers, His Excellency Marek Magierowski, Polish Ambassador to Israel. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to participate in this event. My friend Boaz Bismuth, Editor-in-Chief of Israel Hayom, Dr. Najat Saied from United Arab Emirates. What a glimpse of fresh air in these grim times to be able to be with you on the same panel. Only a week after our countries have signed the normalization accord, which will soon be a peace accord. And welcome, marhaba. Last but not least, my good friend Jaroslaw Wlodarczyk, the CEO of the Press Club Warsaw and also the Secretary General of the International Organization of Press Clubs, and a dear friend indeed. In 1787, Thomas Jefferson wrote that if he had to choose between, I quote, a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter, end of quote. I can tell you right now that if I were confronted with the same dilemma today, I would have given the same answer Jefferson gave more than 2 centuries ago. And the reason is not only because of the poor performance of the Israeli government in managing the health and economic aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic, is because democracy can't survive without free press, which informs the people and enables them to make rational decisions. But then, of course, democracy must have a functioning government as well. And so the topic of our discussion today is the relationship between media and government, and more specifically, one aspect of government activity, diplomacy. To start with, diplomacy needs secrecy, working behind closed doors, under the radar, while the media wishes to uncover and to expose. So it's presumably a head-on conflict, which is frequently fueled by leaks, and I believe leaks would be discussed by you later. But governments were able to devise some kind of a modus vivendi with the media in this area, and I refer to censorship. In Israel, for example, a newspaper or a media outlet must submit to the censor everything related to military operation or stories touching what is considered sensitive state interest. I'll give you an example. In July 1993, I was the head of the Government Press Office of Israel then. Haaretz newspaper published on the front page that Israel and the PLO had been negotiating in Europe a peace accord. I asked the censor, why did you, a few weeks later, I asked him, why did you let them run it? It could have sabotaged the secret deal. And he said, well, I checked with Shimon Peres, our foreign minister at the time, and he flatly denied it. So I asked Shimon Peres myself, and he said, yeah, it wasn't true. Haaretz said it was taking place in Stockholm, and it was taking place in Oslo. So this was his way of overcoming this thing. So during a sensitive diplomatic process, governments sometimes tend to limit the freedom of the press, and by doing so, they try to balance the right of the people to know and the right of the elected government to pursue its goal. But once the sensitive phase is over, it is the duty of the press to critically examining the products of diplomacy. I'll give you an example from these days. Last week on the South Lawn of the White House, Prime Minister Netanyahu signed the accord with the UAE and Bahrain, and up till this moment, the citizens of Israel don't actually know what's in this accord. When rumors started that part of the deal is the sale of advanced aircraft, the F-35 to the UAE, which means compromising Israel's traditional qualitative military edge, Netanyahu sort of denied it. But as we speak, Defense Minister Benny Gantz is in Washington, obviously trying to minimize the damage. I think the press should have been more assertive here in checking into the facts, but maybe this is because COVID-19 now dominates the agenda. I'd like to conclude my remarks with 3 points, or rather questions, that I'd like to present to you, hoping that perhaps you'd like to address them. Number one, we are probably talking about a press or media that presumably conform with the traditional professional and ethical codes of journalism. But is this really the case in an era of social media? Second thought or question, I mentioned before that there are times when press freedom might retreat before top state interests. But what about a situation when a diplomat or a journalist finds out that his or her country is about to commit something absolutely wrong or even terrible? Would or should the diplomat leak, or should the journalist or the editor run it even by breaking loyalty to organization or censorship laws? And I'm talking about a democracy, of course, so I wouldn't expect in August 1939 a German or Russian diplomat or journalist to expose the Molotov-Ribbentrop secret accord in order to sabotage it. But something like the Pentagon Papers, although it's about the Vietnam War, not exactly about diplomacy, but something that the government wants to keep secret, and Daniel Ellsberg and the New York Times disagree. And third point, what happens when a journalist becomes a diplomat? You remember that in February 2002, Thomas Friedman of the New York Times met Saudi Crown Prince Abdullah and encouraged him to make a comprehensive attempt to end the Arab-Israeli conflict. And a few weeks later, Abdullah proposed the Arab Peace Initiative. So what happens when the line is blurred between diplomats and journalists? I leave you with these thoughts or questions, and I wish you and our viewers a very interesting session.
Thank you, Uri. So we'll begin with Ambassador Magierowski. You were a reporter and editor and columnist for over 20 years, including deputy editor-in-chief of several outlets, and you presided over the fields of economics, business, and foreign affairs for several newspapers. So how did this career, your first career, impact your present-day career?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share some thoughts about the links between journalism and diplomacy, and also politics in a broader context. Let me first take a few steps back to a period in which I was no longer a journalist, but not yet a diplomat. I quit journalism in 2015 to become the spokesperson of the Polish president, Mr. Andrzej Duda. After years of writing about politics, interacting with politicians and fellow journalists, expressing views, sharing comments, I regarded myself fit for the job, although I was also aware of my shortcomings. But in my wildest dreams, had I not assumed that I would be facing a completely unexpected challenge, I had to kill first nature and start living in an alien skin. As a commentator, I relished fencing in TV and radio talk shows, sometimes concluding the argument bruised by shamelessly satisfied, with skyrocketing self-esteem. And then all of a sudden, there was me, standing in front of a bunch of bloodthirsty reporters on a shaky ground, by no means on an equal footing, trying to sell the president's policies with a calm voice, struggling to find the precise words and definitions, scanning the facial reactions of the audience, and most importantly, trying not to comment and trying not to interact with all those predators who were just, lurking patiently to ambush me, to prove my incompetence, to ridicule my performance. So from day one, I was like defenseless. This is, I believe, the most fundamental change you experience when you shed your journalistic skin and assume the mantle of a spokesperson. It's like Dr. Jekyll, a respected scientist, transforming into Mr. Hyde, whom everybody dislikes, with a caveat that the process is basically irreversible. And as Dr. Hyde, Mr. Hyde, you can't even kill anyone. So the same principle applies to diplomacy. All ambassadors are spokespersons of their respective countries. We do engage in political discussions, although with myriad restrictions and red lines, or to put it even more figuratively, with miles and miles of tripwires. A fine argument, a historical parallel, a gentle joke can help you in your diplomatic efforts, but used recklessly or even too frequently can sink your career. This is paradoxically where my journalistic toolbox becomes useful. The more tumultuous the debates I took part in, the more I applied myself to find the appropriate words, the adequate comparisons, to make myself better understood by the public, but first and foremost, to crush my opponents. Diplomacy is usually not about crushing your enemy. Otherwise, we wouldn't be diplomats, but warriors or intelligence operatives. But the necessity of acting and expressing views in a precise fashion is paramount in both professions. Had I not been precise in my previous incarnation, I would have been flooded now with hundreds of incriminating articles and posts and tweets I published in the past as a conservative pundit, so to speak. In the course of nearly 20 years, I earned a legion of critics, people who don't like my set of beliefs, and some of them just don't like me personally. And when you choose to quit journalism, you cross the Rubicon and you enter the world of politics. You can expect those very people to dredge up your archives, to find something, an article, a tweet, a short, to bash you are not qualified to be a diplomat, and say on domestic European Union about Angela Merkel, about Russia, about Israel, you can't easily get rid of, no matter how many tweets you delete in a feverish effort to wipe. As I said, my opponents did find something, a few stupid tweets, some sarcastic comments. I did cross red lines as a journalist, and of course, I'm ashamed of this. Trying to explain that those were different times and that I was expressing my private opinions in a different capacity, and generally speaking, that the world was different, does not help. You just have to live with it, to swallow the unpleasant reminiscences and not to pretend that you are innocent. I'm lucky, though, I never wrote that this or that head of state was an idiot, that this or that country is, quote unquote, sick. Sometimes I was smart enough to change my mind with regard to a fundamental political dilemma. For instance, years ago, I staunchly argued against adopting the euro. Then I flip-flopped, and as deputy editor of a major Polish newspaper, I wrote an op-ed calling for a frank debate about adopting the common currency. It was pretty hilarious because in that very comment, I generously encouraged all Europhiles to at least listen to the arguments of Eurosceptics. So I was in favor of Euro, but also quite cunningly in favor of an open exchange of ideas. If you ask me now which side I take today, I'd rather we spoke about the Middle East peace process. In this area, at least, I have a very clear opinion. I am in favor of peace. So the intellectual precision, the verbal discipline, is also an asset for a diplomat. When you try to convey a message to ordinary people, and I'm not using this term in a pejorative sense. What I mean is that it is about time to change our perception of how a diplomat should represent her or his country. Diplomacy is no longer only about meeting fellow diplomats at receptions. Diplomacy is not only about exchanging state documents with foreign ministry officials and arranging bilateral visits. It's not only about delivering lengthy bombastic speeches on the occasion of your national holiday. Of course, we do all these things. I personally specialize in lengthy bombastic speeches about Poland, but we also attempt to reach out to a wider audience with a much more tailored message. Before the pandemic, I was traveling around Israel, meeting with Israeli teenagers, teachers, social activists, mayors of towns in the remotest corners of the country. And I was using my toolbox, journalistic toolbox again. What I learned as a commentator, particularly writing about international affairs, was the fact that the readers may be not very knowledgeable in this section. And my primary task is to explain, not to show off my own expertise. At the beginning of my career in the print media, I remember one of my mentors giving me a very simple piece of advice. If you write about, say, European politics, do not forget that your piece will not be read solely by scholars who spent their entire lives studying European politics, but it will be probably read by your 75-year-old aunt, who perhaps does know more or less who Angela Merkel is, but Emmanuel Macron doesn't ring a bell. And the difference between the European Parliament and the European Council is pretty vague, to say the least. So I must adapt to the capabilities and the needs of the audience, not the other way around. This is what I do when I meet those teenagers in Kiryat Motzkin, the students in Sderot, the teachers in Ramat HaSharon, engaging in a conversation about contemporary Poland. They learn from me, and I learn a lot from them, especially once they realize how poor my knowledge about contemporary Israel is. And they act and speak accordingly, treating me like a 75-year-old Polish aunt. At those meetings, I become a journalist again, and believe me or not, I love it. Thanks a lot. I apologize for the technical problem. I hope I have been helpful, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and remarks. Let me also extend my heartfelt gratitude to the Jerusalem Press Club and to Kasia Rybka-Iwanska, Head of Public Diplomacy at the Polish Embassy, for coordinating the preparations for this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And from one ambassador to another former ambassador, Mr. Bismuth, please go ahead.
Right. So here I am again. So first of all, thank you for the Jerusalem Press Club and to the Polish Embassy and for the opportunity to be here. Now you asked me a specific question about, of course, the peace treaty and what's going on. And as a journalist, as a diplomat, and combine both of them together. So permit me, and I'll be really short because I know we have only 1 hour and we have other guests, but I'll be very short with two small insights or two little anecdotes that are very private to me that maybe explain to me and answer also the question about diplomacy and journalism. You know, let's start with the second one. When I was ambassador in Mauritania, and Muslim country, Islamic country, Arabic country, belongs to the Arab League. And I was very, how would I say, I was very lucky because I was the only Israeli ambassador in the Arab world in those same years. It was 2004, 2008. Let's put in perspective this time, I mean, after the second Intifada, Oman, Tunis, Morocco, Qatar, all closed their bureaus of Israel over there. And Egypt and Jordan called back their ambassador from Tel Aviv. So I was the only one, I mean, who stayed in an Arabic capital. And we had also a Mauritanian ambassador in Tel Aviv. And I remember we had the European Parliament who came a delegation. And of course, there was this debate. And they're all, as usual, you know, in the international arena or organization, as usual. I mean, who do you criticize? You criticize Israel. It's kind of obvious. And I was there in front of the public, and also foreign diplomats, when they're in the Arabic world, they also participate in this, of course, criticism ceremony, or whatever you want to call it. And then, I mean, when they had no more people to quote and no more questions, they brought me the newspaper Haaretz. And even in Haaretz, I mean, they criticized Israel. And I said to myself, how lucky I am to belong or to represent a country where we have such a free media like Israel. And this is like kind of huge, and I was so happy about it. Now, when I was proposed to be ambassador, I didn't want to leave my profession as a journalist, because, I mean, try to imagine the profession I had. I was based in Paris, and the world was my office. I mean, I was waking up in the morning, I don't know, I could wake up in Germany covering politics over there, and going to sleep in Iraq when they found Saddam Hussein in the hole. And I covered any big event you can think of. I covered the Iraq war, #1, #2, Afghanistan, Kosovo, politics, Rwanda, everything you want, I was there, covering from very close. And Israel called me, and they said, we would like you to be ambassador. Of course, when they proposed such a thing, this is a great honor. And then I said to myself, wait a second, can you do the job properly? And I said to myself, wait a second, as a journalist, what do? I interview people, and then as a diplomat, I will meet people. Then you write articles, and then I will write cables. And the third thing, when you're Israeli, of course, I mean, you represent your country. You're very, me as very Zionist. I mean, and as an ambassador, I'll do what I do as a journalist. So for me, it was very natural to go to that job. And now we'll go to what's happening right now between Israel and the Arab world and the agreements you spoke. I was very lucky in 2005 when, then it was secret. Now, I mean, everybody speaks about it openly. When they opened the Israeli bureau very discreetly, very secretly in Dubai, in the Emirates, and they needed, of course, for Israeli with foreign passport. And 2 of my staff in Mauritania went there. So I was like part of the secret I knew, because the staff went there. Now, when I left my embassy in 2008, naturally I went back to my newspaper, to journalism. Of course, I knew that thing. I knew that this bureau works and operates in the Emirates. Did I publish it? Did I ever talk about it? Of course, I could do it. I could do it. I mean, in foreign media, now in social media, I could, and not even thinking of censorship. But I heard the word Dromi at the beginning. And of course, we have censorship in Israel, but it's called also responsibility. Should we, and this is a question as an editor-in-chief that I'm asking you, should we publish everything we know? And can we disconnect from a journalist also our nationality, also our national sentiment that we have? And this is a big question. Should we say everything? So sometimes, I mean, you have to publish things, of course, I mean, if it's something that is wrong. But when you know that you have a relationship with an Arab country, and that you know that if you publish it, you might put it on stake, and you can cause closing this bureau or this embassy. In this case, it wasn't an embassy. Should you do it? I thought that I should not. I could 10 years ago, when I went back to news journalism, publish it. I did not. And this is among the things I'm very happy I did not publish. And there are a few things that I still know today that I will not publish or not reveal, because I think that it's not only about publishing everything, and this is also the limits of social media, that you do not even want to think, and you don't have the responsibility of us, the classical media, of taking everything out without the consequences. Now, concerning the agreements, I would like, last thing is concerning what Uri Dromi said about the deal that we don't know a lot. I'm talking about the Emirates, Bahrain deal with Israel, especially the Emirates deal with Israel. And Uri mentioned, of course, the plane. I mean, planes, or this time it was like the F-35, that can put on stake, I mean, Israel's security. This is another thing that we see the role of a media. The media wants to be an actor. A media wants to be an actor and going further from the job that they have. The job of the media is to tell, first of all, is to be reliable and to be honest and to give facts as they are. Of course, I mean, you can have interpretation. You can, of course, have your comment. You can have, of course, this is op-eds, I mean, are done for this. But when it comes to facts, you have to be straight to the facts and not arrange the facts according to your agenda. And this is very dangerous. And what we saw with the Arab deal is exactly when Israel signs a deal, and I will admit, I am editor-in-chief of the biggest Israeli newspaper, which happens to be a conservative newspaper, and which does not think that the Israel government is doing everything that he's doing is wrong. Now, with this deal, the next day, instead of applauding and saluting a deal with an Arabic country, what did we hear? The planes, and of course, it's a very old, we have a relationship with this country. It's nothing, it's just to expand the normalization between the two countries. So let me tell you, as an ambassador in another country, that this is totally wrong, nonsense, and I totally, refuse this comment, and I'll tell you why. The fact that we can have open relationship that we did not have when we signed with Jordan and Egypt, or with Mauritania. We're always discreet. Let me tell you a story. When I was ambassador in Mauritania, for example, I was always invited at night to the president. Always, everything I did was discreet. And when they had, for example, the French embassy brought Ben-Hur to Mauritania, to Nouakchott, I was not invited, of course. Here, it's happening in the open air, under the light. And on the contrary, you see Arab population happy, applauding. This is one. This is why it is very, very important. And media should, on the contrary, applaud this thing. Comment number two. Uri said we don't know exactly what's in the agreement, but we do know that the planes are not there. And what is funny is that the same media that speaks for peace, the same media in Israel that is for the camp of peace, the same media that said nothing for the Iran deal, on the contrary, applauded the Iran deal that was dangerous for Israel. This media that said nothing when Egypt got an F-15 and Emirates had F-16 Block 60 and Bahrain had F-16 Block 72, very, very sophisticated radar. And Saudi Arabia had the AWACS. This was okay, we could sleep at night. But when a right-wing government makes a peace with the Emirates, oh my God, it wasn't the right government that made the peace. So immediately you see irresponsible media being an actor in order to disturb, how would I say, a new step in history that is phenomenal. I'm very lucky. I was ambassador of my country, editor-in-chief of a newspaper. And in this thing, I can tell you, as an Israeli, I must admit, as a very passionate love to my country, in both cases, I saw a lot of resemblance, but in both cases, you need a lot of responsibility. But still, as an editor-in-chief, the thing is, I want to show the maximum, to reveal the maximum. As an ambassador, I wanted to be as discreet as possible. Yet, and I will conclude by that, I know that we're now with the Polish embassy, but allow me to quote an Austrian author, Stefan Zweig, amazing author. And he had this magnificent book, and that I quote all the time, every time I'm invited to Zooms, The World of Yesterday. If anyone did not read this book, he has to read it immediately. This book is about the changing world. And what we're seeing us right now, by the way, this Zoom is also part of this changing world, unfortunately, but we're in a changing world. And also diplomacy has to adapt itself into a world where everything is almost transparent. And this is the new thing. For journalism, on the contrary, it's only helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bismuth, and we'll see if our next speaker agrees. Joining us from Abu Dhabi, normally something that would not have been possible, at least in public several months ago. Dr. Najat Saied is a columnist for the Arabic language daily Ittihad in the UAE, and also for American TV Hurra. She was editor-in-chief of Women magazines in Dubai, and originally hails from Saudi Arabia. Dr. Saied, you're welcome to turn your video back on, and we'd like to hear from you as well, if you are still with us.
Okay, hi everybody. Just, can you see me now? Can you see me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to talk. What I'm going to be talking about today is talking about my book, which is still under publication. The book name is Gulf Tweets, Twitter Diplomacy and Media Polarization. And then I'm going to connect the book, even though it didn't talk about the peace treaty that happened recently, but I'm going to connect my book to the peace treaty and my concerns about the media and in relation to that peace treaty. The book is based actually on a study to examine the polarization in the US and the UK media. So here, the assumption is that media in general, including journalism, of course, is the cause of polarization that makes the mission of diplomacy quite difficult. And the apparent bias in their coverage of UAE and Saudi Arabia, creating distorted narratives around both countries that do immense damage to their national image. So the study examines the media polarization in relation to 4 topics, which is the Qatar diplomatic crisis, the war in Yemen, Iran, and the Muslim Brotherhood. The subject of the Muslim Brotherhood is further complicated by Jamal Khashoggi, who was a strong advocate of the Muslim Brotherhood and whose murder intensified media bias in the West to a maximum degree. So I just want to explain briefly what kind of polarization that is happening in relation to those four topics. First of all, the Qatar diplomatic crisis that happened and began in 2017 has resulted in division of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and has increased the political media polarization globally. When you look at the Western media, especially in the US and the UK, it couldn't understand that the main concern of this diplomatic crisis is because of the Qatar support to the political Islam, and mainly the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's not only because of its support to the Muslim Brotherhood or other political Islamists like the Shiite militias like Hezbollah, for example. It's not only that. They want to topple the regimes in stable countries like, for example, Egypt, like UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain. They want to topple that and substitute it with radical political Islamists. And Al Jazeera is basically, that is sometimes is looked in the Western world and in the Western media as the voice of the voiceless, as the voice of democracy, as the voice of free speech. It's actually in Arabic mainly. It's the voice of Islamists and radical Islamists, and it's flaming the Arab world to topple those regimes and to substitute them with radical Islamists. So here, the media is a cause of polarization, not for peace, not for democracy, not for freedom of speech. The other subject that I mentioned, and I will brief it up here, the war in Yemen, that also has polarized the media against Saudi Arabia and UAE because of the humanitarian crisis. Well, okay, we are all against the humanitarian crisis, but the problem of the Western media, and it's always focusing on the sectarian conflict. It's oversimplifying the cause as if it is a proxy between Shia and Sunnah. But that Saudi Arabia and the coalition is against this Shiite militia. It's actually, the conflict is against statehood versus non-statehood. The problem with Iran is not because it's a Shiite regime, because it is supporting militias, supporting non-government, non-statehood. This is the main thing, this is the main core of conflict. And actually in the media, we don't see that. They're making it as it is a proxy between sects. No, it is a proxy between it is actually a war between stability and instability, between those who are running for peace and those who are against us. It is a conflict between those who are pro-statehood and those who are pro-ideologies and radical ideologies. This is the main conflict that we don't see in the media. Adding to that polarization, of course, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi that we see in every single outlet in the media, which is like now it's like an appetizer, as if it is an appetizer in a meal. Whenever you hear they talk about Saudi Arabia, they never miss the chance of talking about Jamal Khashoggi. Well. So they attack Saudi Arabia because of this case, and attack mainly the Prince Mohammed bin Salman for this case. Well, everybody couldn't deny that it is a mistake, it is a problem, it is a disaster, and all who did it are persecuted. But the main question that I raise in my book, why he was hired from the beginning to the Washington Post? He was hired basically only because he's attacking Saudi Arabia. Is that legal? Well, the media is trying to show that Jamal Khashoggi is only an editor-in-chief and a journalist. Well, he was not only that. He was a diplomat. He worked in a couple of Saudi embassies. He was also he was working in the intelligence. We all know that his work in Afghanistan was part of intelligence. And he was the advisor of the former intelligence in Saudi Arabia. So here we see the conflict of a career as intelligence, as diplomat, and also as a journalist. So that means a lot of secrets of the government are under his shoulders. So is that legal according to the media law that someone like this will be writing for a foreign newspaper and attacking his own country. If he was against his country, why he agreed from the beginning to work for the government, as diplomat and as a part of the intelligence? So all of these questions was raised up in the book. Also, so the book is trying to ask here whether Twitter diplomacy by the UAE and Saudi Arabia will be able to influence the polarization of the mainstream media, which informs its bias with regards to the 4 key political issues mentioned earlier. For this study, mainstream outlets that are focused on are the ones in the US and the UK, basically because they are in English, so which is an international language, and that gives it a global reach. And secondly, with this wide audience reach, a biased Western media can, against any country or any person, can basically damage the country's image and will lead to character assassination for individual, which is really dangerous. So the research question, to what extent is Twitter diplomacy in the UAE and Saudi Arabia able to influence the 4 significant political matters that have been polarized in the American and British media? Can Twitter diplomacy be a tool for international broadcasting to increase advocacy for these media outlets? Is Twitter diplomacy sufficient to improve the perception of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the UK and the US? Also, can Twitter diplomacy be used to build positive images of the UAE and Saudi Arabia in the Western public? So here, Saudi Arabia and UAE were selected specifically among the GCC because of their strong ties together and because of the establishment of the Saudi Emirati Coordination Council back in 2016. So I will give just a brief definition of Twitter diplomacy or topmolacy, which is the use of Twitter by the heads of state or diplomats and the leaders of intergovernmental organizations to conduct diplomatic outreach and public diplomacy. So accordingly, what I used in the book, both quantitative and qualitative analysis to just see how many tweets from 2015 to 2018 on those two topics, 4 selected topics by those candidates. I chose candidates from the UAE and from Saudi Arabia, and I measured how many tweets on these topics, and also I did qualitative analysis to the critical discourse analysis to the tweets of those tweets. And I used different theories about that. The main theory that I used is the mediatization to analyze the language of those tweets. And then I used the framing theory, which is basically to see how those tweets are embedded in the Western media, mainly in the US and the UK. And I used the theory of certain agenda to see the sentiments of those tweets by those diplomats and political leaders on the public. So basically, the interest of the Twitter diplomacy in the Arab world started mainly after what is called the Arab Spring in late 2011, which resulted in a massive destruction of infrastructure, thousands of deaths during and the aftermath of the revolutions, and transformation of a number of Arab countries into failed states, unfortunately. These revolutions and demonstrations were exploited by opportunist parties, which is mainly the political Islamists and mainly the Muslim Brotherhood, and were inflamed by social networks as Twitter and Facebook. Another factor that encouraged for Twitter diplomacy in the Gulf is that Arab governments and their foreign ministries up to the importance of digital diplomacy because a lot of several academics, whether Arab and non-Arab organizations, institutes, and foreign ministries such as the Academy of Change in Qatar, the National Democratic Institute, and the International Republican, and also the Department of State were all involved in this kind of digital diplomacy and also encouraging the public to rebel against their governments, which led afterwards to failed states, as we saw in Yemen, as we saw in Syria, and it could have happened also in Egypt if the last revolution, the June 30th revolution, didn't happen. So what I tried to explore in my book is basically what is the cause actually of this media polarization. So we know that any kind of media is basically the reflection of politics. It doesn't come like this. So the lack of any bipartisan agreement within the United States on critical matters in the Middle East, especially in regarding of the topics that mentioned in the book, increased polarization in the media. So for example, the right-leaning lobbies and their media hold one position, and the left-leaning media hold another position, which is causing all of this kind of media polarization. So we see what happened in the Obama administration in terms of supporting Iran, in terms of the Iranian deal, in terms of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, are actually taking a different perspective in the Trump administration. With this kind of differences is causing a lot of turmoil in the region, because even we agree that democracy is basically based on the differences, but when it comes to critical matters like security issues, it can cause a lot of turmoil because a lot of people are taking advantage of this kind of split between the right and the left, especially those radicals and advocates of political Islam. So what happens and the main problem that the liberal Western media and the liberal parties like the Obama administration finds political Islam like the Muslim Brotherhood to be convenient antidotes for the groups like Daesh and the Al-Qaeda, because they view them as versions of moderate Islam, while they are not. And also liberal Westerners equate, if you attack political Islamists, you are considered as against Islam, which is not the case even among moderate Muslims. So on the other hand, conservative parties find the political Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood are gateway to extremism. So supporting them means supporting extremist groups like Daesh and Al-Qaeda. So this can explain why the anti-Qatar quartet like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain are allied to the conservative media, while the advocate of the political Islam as Qatar, Turkey, and Iran are allied to liberal leftist parties in the West. So, and that is reflected even in the media, which is causing a huge turmoil and a huge split.
Dr. Saied, the argument is very interesting and very clear. We look forward to reading more about it when we do read your book. We also have a recommendation for another book.
But let me just end up, quickly, please, Talia. I'm afraid what is happening in the US and the UK will happen even in the Israeli media, because I know in the Israeli media there's also kind of split between the right and the left. So what my concern is whether that kind of split will be taken advantage of by radical Islamists, because the some parties in Israel and some some leftist media is against the peace treaty, not because they are against the concept of peace, but because they are actually against Netanyahu. And that is a problem when you are against something only because you are against a leader. And a lot of political Islamists and who are against the peace treaty will be taking advantage of that in order to make this peace treaty fail. Thank you.
Can I say something?
I think before we allow
just a little remark.
Jaroslaw has been waiting very patiently for nearly an hour.
Just a little remark. I hope your book, madam, I hope your book will be published not only in Hebrew, but also in other languages. Because if you publish it in Hebrew, believe me, it's a bestseller. Thank you very much for what you said. Very, very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, we will save a little bit of time towards the end for further interactions, but let's let our final speaker, who's been waiting very patiently, have a chance to speak as well. Jaroslaw Wlodarczyk, you're also the founding member of the Press Club in Poland, not just the Secretary General of the International Association of Press Clubs, but you've also been a former media advisor to the Polish Prime Minister, and you were a journalist yourself. So please, we would be very happy to hear your remarks.
Thank you so much for invitation, and I will stick more closely to the journalism because I know relatively little about diplomacy. So of course, it's tempting to talk a lot about things you don't know, but I will try to speak more about journalism. So first of all, what very well was highlighted by Dromi, that today we have to define what is a journalism. When, if we make a distinction between professional journalism and amateur journalism, as I call it, or some people call it social journalism, amateur from the perspective, not any ethical code, no taken responsibility, what is written. So then we are talking about professional journalism. The same we talk about professional diplomacy. And the question, does journalism help or hinder diplomacy? I would rather say that politics, as Ambassador Magierowski said, wider, not only diplomacy, but politics, we are, as journalists, we are in the continuing conflict between journalism and politics. Because we are working, we are looking for a truth, which is not necessarily the part of the work of politicians. We want to have an unlimited as possible access to information, which is not necessarily the point of politicians. And what is probably the most important thing, we should not, as journalists, have agenda. Contrary to politicians, especially diplomats, which are working only on political agenda and initiating that agenda. So we are, on one hand, in the continuing conflict. On the other hand, we need a close cooperation and symbiosis, because politicians and diplomats, it's one of our key sources of information. Of course, we are looking for, to verify this information, to confront it with reality, etc. I mean, with real world, we are looking for another stories, not only these ones which are provided by politicians, but access to information and limits of the access of information, which are coming always from politicians. It's one of the most dangerous points for journalism. So, and there will be never friendship between journalists and politicians, are symbiotic cooperating relations. And I want to also say that, of course, journalism is helping diplomacy when you look to Polish ambassador Marek Magierowski. His journalist background made him one of the best Polish diplomats. So from that perspective, journalism is helping, because when formerly you were a journalist and you worked on the other side of the wall, you understand politics much better, comparing to people whose whole career was only politics. You are closer to people. You understand the mechanism from outside, not only from inside. So that's why journalism is giving tremendous background for diplomats. I do not agree that it's Rubicon. From that perspective, you cannot return. One of the speakers is an example who was ambassador and is now a journalist. In Poland, we've got also very known journalist who was ambassador, a Polish ambassador to South America, to one of the countries, and now he's one of the most known and good journalists in Poland. So, so it's possible to return to journalism, but true, it's very difficult. And also, as a closing point, I would say, returning to the topic, does journalism help or hinder diplomacy? We have to define and think twice what is help and what is hinder. I mean, at the end of the day, what is goal of journalists and journalism and diplomacy? And if we will define that journalism and diplomacy are working in public interest from different perspectives. Journalists from the perspective of our listeners, viewers, readers, and diplomats from the perspective of their governments. But these governments are working, I mean, they should work for good for citizens. Therefore, we can help each other. But as I said, more often we will hinder, because there will be never friendship between journalism and politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wlodarczyk. You've already spoken a bit about this topic, so maybe I'll direct it to the other speakers. We have questions coming in about really the definitions that you have just made, taking into consideration the ethics behind journalism and the division that must be maintained, and which audience each branch serves, whether it's journalism as the watchdog and government as
the dog.
The decision as the dog. And so I would like to hear a little bit more, perhaps from Mr. Bismuth, perhaps from the ambassador, about your definitions of these two groups, and whether you think that there should be any sort of set boundaries between them in order to maintain this ethical standard.
I start? Okay.
Please do.
Thank you, Ambassador. Look, what did I say before I spoke about? I mean, I think that I mentioned, I mean, the main thing is ethical. How would I say? It's like the Bible. It's like the 11th commandment for a journalist, and it comes after reliability, because that's what we have. That's what we can sell. I mean, this is ethics. It's to be honest. Imagine now you're design clothes. What do you have? You have your tailor. You have your cloth. You make your shoemaker. You've got your leather. What do we have? What do I have behind me? Is my honesty. I mean, is my reliability. Otherwise, people will not believe me. Now, before I heard someone speaking about, I mean, Mr. Jaroslaw, you spoke about agenda. Journalists must not have agenda. I totally disagree with you, because on the contrary, we all have agenda. I mean, you cannot disconnect a journalist from a human being. I mean, we were born, and before we started, I mean, we went to university, we were right-wing, conservative, liberal, lefty, communist, whatever, Maoist, whatever you want. So you cannot disconnect. It's not because you start writing in a newspaper that all of a sudden, all your agenda, you throw it in the bin. You cannot. Let's be honest, we cannot. And this is why also in America, when you've got newspapers endorsing a candidate, it's totally normal, not only in America. Why in France, Le Figaro likes Sarkozy, ABC liked Aznar, and I don't know, the Thomas Friedman liked Obama, Fox News liked Trump. It's okay. The fact is that what I said before about the journalist is two things I would say. First of all, and that's what I said also before, don't use your information, or don't interpret your information or the information according to your agenda. That's what I said before about the Emirates and the F-35. You take an agreement that was done by a government that you do not approve, and you invent like a clause that is not in the agreement at all, and then you invent and you create a story, and that's totally, and then the next day, someone says, oh, yes, we're going to sell those planes, and you say, I was right. This is totally something that you cannot do as a journalist. You have to be honest, reliable. The second thing is to not forget, I mean, where your place is. We, as journalists, we meet politicians, we meet high-ranked people. As an editor-in-chief, who do you speak to? You speak to, of course, to Prime Minister, to President, to heads of parties, I mean, to High Court judge. I mean, these are the people you deal with. But don't forget, and this is very important, you represent your readers. You're here for your readers. You're not part of this this political elite or political economics or whatever. Don't forget your role. Don't forget your place. When I stand here, or when I'm in front of you, when I was ambassador, so of course I was very, very, how would I say? I was very, I was a walking flag, and this is huge. but still, you represent your government. This is obvious because the government decides and the government represents the people. But as an editor-in-chief, with all due respect, I have an agenda. I'm a conservative editor-in-chief. When I go to vote, I vote for a conservative party. I will not hide it. Yet, if there is a news or if a conservative government is not doing what you are supposed to do, then of course I will write against it. And you want an example from the last weeks? I'll give you. My newspaper, for example, is for sovereignty. I think that Israel, yes, should. It's about time that we have our borders in the eastern borders. It's about time. Of course, we had the peace before sovereignty. My newspaper will continue to fight for it. And if a right-wing government will not do it, then we will attack it for it and we will put pressure on it. This is what I should do because this is my agenda. I do not adapt myself to government. I adapt myself to my belief and especially to honesty, reliability. This is what I have. And yes, I do have an agenda and there's no opposition between them. It's totally okay.
May I answer? May I answer just one question? I think we agree that this is the point of the definition. When I said journalism has no agenda, it doesn't mean doesn't have opinion. Mm-hmm. It means that we are not policymakers.
Yes. So I will answer you again, but fortunately or unfortunately, nowadays, I mean, what has happened, and this is all over the world, and you can see journalists are starting or are wishing or becoming actors. And this is why when they stop doing their newspaper or their TV program, you see them acting in a very, very, how would I say, in social media. Nowadays, you cannot, and this is what I said before about the world of Stefan Zweig, this is the changing world. The changing world is not only about the Middle East changing, and when I heard my friend from the Emirates speaking, sometimes I heard myself speaking because all of a sudden we have the same interest, we have the same enemies. What do I care? What does she care if I'm Jewish or what do I care if she's Muslim? We have the same interest for our children. This is in politics. In agenda, in journalism, the way we do journalism, the platform has changed. The expectation from me has changed. And yes, people would like to listen to what I have to say because, I mean, if you want in a certain way, newspapers, journalists, editor-in-chief, if you want, not me, of course, they have also their fan club and people would like to listen to them. And you've seen them beautifully in America. Thomas Friedman, you cannot say that he's not only a journalist, he's an actor right now. Or the other one, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, I forgot his name right now, when he was going to see Obama the same way I go to the kitchen, I mean, of course, I mean, he was an actor because he was transferring his agenda. By the way, it was a liberal agenda. It's very funny, by the way, when you have a liberal agenda and when you're a liberal media, then it's totally okay. But if you're a conservative media, then you're a yes man of government. This is also just a little anecdote in this changing world that I had to tell you too. Yes.
I have to answer it, sorry, because...
if you may, just one more response before we move over to Marek, because
I promise not to answer.
To be an actor in politics is not a journalism. There is a very good expression commonly used in the US that we are writing, we are not fighting. And we as a journalist, we can comment it, we can have opinion, which must be separated from the information, although we are not actors in sense of making politics. We influence politics by informing societies, but we should not be active player in politics. And I think we all agree that journalism is because we serve our audiences, not politics.
Okay, just last answer. In a world where perception is reality, in a world where communication is so important, in a world where image is almost everything, you cannot tell me that a politician is not disconnected by what media will say about it, and therefore media is becoming more and more actor. This is one. But media is also to remember, that I write a newspaper, you can choose to read it or not, but the politician or especially government has been elected. Now you cannot on one hand speak democracy, 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 and not respect also what the people have chosen. Those are democratic regime. This government that has taken a decision still was chosen by the people. So media has also needed, and I say as an editor-in-chief, we need also to be a little bit more humble towards decision of the people and democracy.
Master Magierowski, do you agree with the things said before you?
Very briefly, two things. I believe we have been talking about journalism, but actually there are two journalisms. There has always been two journalisms. since the very inception of this profession. The one galaxy includes commentators, columnists, and pundits, and they do have an agenda, of course, they've always had. The other galaxy includes reporters whose primary task and obligation is to deliver news. Now, I will tell you why I actually quit journalism 5 years ago, because I was afraid that journalism, all these two kinds of journalism, were heading in a very dangerous direction, namely tribalism. The tribal journalism, I think, is constitutes the most important, the crucial danger to the future of this profession. If a reporter crosses the Rubicon, to use that parallel again, that means that journalism is under immense stress. And we have also been, for many years, under immense pressure on the part of the social networks. For example, there has been a lot of news websites mushrooming over the last 2 decades in the United States, in Poland, in Israel, in France, and Germany. Now, my question would be whether we can actually find news on those websites. There are news websites in Poland where you can find no news, just interpretations, just comments, just, at best analysis, but also written in a very blistering language. So, for example, I'm thirsty. I'm missing the ancient world in which I could consume news. Now it's very hard for me to consume news because I don't find any. I find interpretations. I find comments. So it's not that easy. For example, when I try to follow Polish politics, it's not easy for me to find a credible news source on which I could base my own interpretation of facts and developments. So everything is, served on a silver platter. This is our interpretation. You swallow it, or you refuse to accept it. That's it. That's the deal. And I'm very frustrated about about these developments in the journalistic world. So I think that we have to be very precise, trying to define what journalism in plural we are talking about.
Dr. Saied, you look like you want to give one response to what's been discussed.
Well, I agree with most what has been discussed, but I want to add something like that. There's I share my opinion with the ambassador that there's a difference between reporting and being a columnist. If you want to report something in journalism, you have to give me facts and you have to give me objective facts. And if you want to have your own agenda, show that through the opinion writers, not through facts. The problem that now these days we see a split journalism, totally different facts between the right and the left. For example, nobody can deny that this peace treaty that happened between UAE and Bahrain and Israel is something really good, something that everybody should be excited about, and it is positive no matter what. But when you open like liberal media, like the Washington Post, like the New York Times, they always try to underestimate it. Why? Because who dealt with it is Netanyahu, who dealt with it is Trump, and they are against them, which is something I see it quite childish and not really professional. You have to admit that this is something good. If the Palestinians are not involved directly, that doesn't mean that it is not good. Sometimes peace treaty can be done directly, sometimes indirectly. So you don't overcome your agenda setting, and if this the same thing that happened by Biden or Obama, you will be exaggerating the success, and because it happened by Trump or Netanyahu, you will understand. This is not journalism. I don't see, this is completely bipartisan media, which is something is not related media. And honestly, this is something that happened recently, because I was born and raised in the US, and I can tell how was the media before in the 80s and how it compare it now. It's not journalism. Call it anything, call it propaganda, call it fake news, call it anything, but it's not journalism at all. Even in the US, things have been changed tremendously. You see a huge split between when you watch Fox News or one American news network, and when you watch, for example, the CNN or MSNBC, as if they are not in one country. Before, they were complementary. Differences were something good. The Democrat is one side, the Republican is one side, one is completing the other. Now they are enemies, and that is reflected in the media. So that's a problem, and the problem, because the foreign policy is actually dominated by the liberal media, that is also causing problem in the Arab world, because in the Arab world, they're basically translating what is in this mainstream media to Arabic. So those who are against, for example, the peace will use what has been used, what has been published in the Western media, like for example, the negatives in the Washington Post or the New York Times or the CNN or say, see, even then they are not quite supportive. Like, for example, the interview that happened between Fareed Zakaria and the editor-in-chief of the UAE National, for example, he was completely not supportive to the peace treaty. Why is that? Why he is doing that? Only because Trump did it? Okay, so this is something I see it as unethical, because you have, no matter what agenda you have, it doesn't have to be on the expense on the media ethics, it's more than media ethics. It's basically the security of this region. This region is already in turmoil. And instead of building trust and building positive attitudes, you're building negative attitudes, and you're being against something really, really positive, only because your political agenda, which is something, it's really unethical and it's so dangerous. That's what I see right now in journalism.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you to everybody who joined our discussion. I know that we have a lot of really interesting topics that we'd like to discuss, and some very sensitive issues that are, of course, very important to all the journalists and diplomats on the line. And I've already received a few requests for a follow-up event, so we'll make sure to get that in our calendars, in our Corona calendars, in the next few months. I'd also like to thank Director General of the Jerusalem Press Club, Dromi, and Press Coordinator Rachel for putting together this call, and of course to our partners at the Polish Embassy. Thank you for your time, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.